sustainable development, what kind of Arctic do we want? And now it's my pleasure to invite the moderator of the discussion, Mr. Markku Heikkilä, who is the head of the science communications in the Arctic Center, and one very important man behind of this conference here today. With Markku, there's going to be many experts of Arctic issues in here on the stage. We are going to have here Aleksi Härkönen, who is the ambassador for Arctic affairs in Finland. We are going to have Anne Coninsx, ambassador at large for the Arctic European External Action Service. We are going to have Donna and Welton, who is the Chargé affairs United States Embassy in Finland. We are going to have Hanne Vugel-Eskjær, who is ambassador for the Arctic Affairs Kingdom of Denmark. We are going to have Arni Bard Sigurdsson, ambassador, senior Arctic official Iceland. Åke B. Grutle, who is Norway's ambassador to Finland, and Maeve Collins, who is ambassador of Ireland to Finland. So there's many of you, and the stage is yours.
Okay.
Have a nice time.
Thank you, Julius. We will have a nice time. And well, first of all, I'd like all our guests now to come to here and take your seats here on the sofa, and we can continue from that then. So the basic idea of this conference was to combine the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals with the Arctic, and we are doing that from different perspectives. Later today, in this conference, we will have a focus on Arctic economy, and Arctic science, and Arctic youth. This session here is about Arctic policies. What do we want when we want to combine the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Arctic? So after these opening sessions, opening speeches, we are here about to discuss with these excellent ambassadors about what can concretely be done when it comes to Arctic policies and UN goals, and hear more about national insights when it comes to that, and also some of your personal ideas in regard to the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. But let me start by inviting the Finnish Arctic Ambassador Aleksi Härkönen to tell us why Finland has chosen exactly this theme as one of the key pillars in the chairmanship program.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, dear Arctic friends. I would like to start with commitments. When the Arctic Council was established in 1996, the Arctic countries gave 3 commitments. They would work for the well-being of the inhabitants of the Arctic, they would work for sustainable development, and they would work for the protection of the Arctic environment. Now these commitments remain valid, and they have been reaffirmed many times by ministers participating in later ministerial meetings, and that was also done this year. These commitments certainly remain valid also because there is a flow of convincing reports and assessments of the Arctic Council underlining the importance of the implementation of these commitments. I would like to continue with the 2 commitments of a new kind, which are well in line with the Arctic Council original commitments. One is the agreement on a universal legally binding climate work, which was completed in Paris 2 years ago, and this morning we heard the important statement by the president of this COP21, Madame Royale. That included a strong commitment by the parties of the agreement. The same year, the UN General Assembly adopted the agenda for Sustainable Development, Agenda 2030, identifying these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which we have also here in front of us. Those are also commitments. They actually are not legally binding, but they are a kind of a guiding framework for activities for the UN members, including the Arctic states. So when planning Finland's chairmanship program, we counted that 1 + 1 is 2. We should put these things together and see how this would serve as a guiding tool for the Arctic Council activities. We discussed these ideas with other Arctic states and with the permanent participants, the organizations representing Arctic indigenous peoples, and we realized that Finland was actually pushing through an open door. Nobody wanted to object to the idea that these frameworks would be useful as a basis for activities. So we were ready to present the program, the draft program, about a year ago in Portland, Maine, the US, and it was well received. The same week, it so happened, the coming chair of the Arctic Council, Minister Timo Soini, spoke at the Arctic Circle conference in Reykjavik, and he gave a hint about the program, saying that it would be useful to explore how the UN Agenda 2030 framework can be utilized in the Arctic context for the benefit of the people and the communities. So those who knew understood that this is going to happen. The final version of the program was presented 6 months ago at the ministerial meeting at Fairbanks, Alaska, and the program was welcomed. The ministers also adopted their declaration. They, as usual, reaffirmed commitments to the 3 original ideas of the Arctic Council, but they added a new commitment. They reaffirmed the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the need for their realization by 2030. So this is a new thing in the Arctic Council. So what does it mean? I would say it can mean 3 things. It can mean something for the long-term guidance of the activities of the Arctic Council. It can provide a solution to the continuous discussion between the regional approach and the global approach. And it can also serve as a guidance to outreach activities. So first about long-term guidance for the Arctic Council itself. The time span for the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals between 2017 and 2030 is 13 years. So this means that almost all the Arctic states will hold the 2-year chairmanship of the Arctic Council in the course of this period. And without trying to predict the priorities of future chairs, I would like to say that there would be an opportunity to use the SDGs as a yardstick in measuring progress in Arctic cooperation. They could also be used as a toolbox for planning projects and monitoring results. My colleagues are well aware that we are embarking on the process of proposing a long-term strategic plan for the Arctic Council, which the ministers are supposed to adopt in 2 years' time. Then, regional versus global approach. The UN agenda would offer also a solution to this discussion, because it would provide ample opportunities to deal with both global and regional approach to development. Of course, the Arctic Council must concentrate on the Arctic region. That is the mandate. But with the advancing climate change and globalization, global developments affecting the Arctic region should be taken into account. So I would like to paraphrase an old slogan, saying that we should think globally, but act locally, but certainly also regionally and nationally. And finally, on outreach. There's a growing need to raise global awareness of Arctic-specific features of developments in global organizations and in the conferences of parties to international agreements. For this purpose, the Arctic Council has already arranged side events at these conferences. 2 weeks ago, the Arctic Council made a presentation at the Climate COP23 held in Bonn. And earlier, we had a side event at the COP of the Minamata Convention. On sustainable development, what would be the best place to raise Arctic awareness? It might be the United Nations High-Level Political Forum, which is held every year. The next one will be held in New York next July. So I would like to end by thanking the organizers, the city of Rovaniemi and the Arctic Center of the University of Lapland for choosing sustainable development as the theme of this conference. And I hope that the discussions will provide inspiration to the application of sustainable development goals in the Arctic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Aleksi, also for proposing us to have this as a team in this conference. So
that's why I'm thanking you.
Next one, I will invite Marianne Coninsx, Ambassador at Large for the Arctic, European Union External Action Service, to give your comments. And if I understood right, this is the first time you are giving comments in a public Arctic conference. It's a new post. Did I understand right that is your...
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me here. And I'm thrilled to be in Rovaniemi, where the whole modern Arctic cooperation started. So also congratulations with that, and also for the team of the conference, the SDGs, which are becoming an increasingly important topic related to the Arctic. You have asked us in preparing this panel that we should choose one of the SDGs and tell us what we think personally about it. But before I will present the choice I made, I just want to indicate why we think that it's absolutely necessary that the SDGs apply to the Arctic. And I would like to mention 3 reasons. First of all, because the Arctic is global. What happens in the Arctic affects the world, and what happens in the world affects the Arctic. It's not the fault of the responsibility of the 4 million people in the living in the Arctic that they are responsible for global warming. The global warming affects them, and they are the hardest hit. Secondly, it's absolutely necessary that the SDGs applies, because if they would not apply, the effects would even more dramatic, particularly in the Arctic. It's estimated that when Paris will be implemented, that still the temperature in the Arctic will rise by 4, 5, 6% by 2030-40, but if there will be no implementation of the Paris Agreement, then it's even the double, with dramatic consequences. And the third reason, and which is for us, European Union, very, very strong reason, is that the Arctic is absolutely a unique example of constructive international cooperation. And this must absolutely remain like that. And I would say it's the spirit of Rovaniemi which should remain. Now, there are many obvious SDGs to choose, I would say, and also it's known that all SDGs are important in C, but I chose SDG number 16. I'll tell you what it is. It's about justice, peace, and strong institutions. Justice, myself, I'm a lawyer. I even studied many years ago law of the sea. But even law and international law is important in the context of the Arctic, and also the rule of law and governance. And in this context, because this SDG goal specifically also mentions the importance of inclusive societies, and here I would like to refer also to the words of the President of the Sami Parliament. It's absolutely necessary to have that the indigenous people and the local populations have a strong voice. Secondly, strong institutions. I'm an official since 34 years of European institutions. Institutions are also very key in implementation SDGs, and particularly we need to have effective, accountable and transparent institutions. And in the context of the Arctic, it's the Arctic Council which plays a very important role, and we're particularly pleased with the Finnish chairmanship that they allowed in Oulu. I don't know if I pronounce it well, but that also observers could speak at the plenary about a topic, pollution prevention, which is a key topic of the mandate of the Arctic Council. And third, the peace and the European Union. Everything the European Union is about peace. We are a peace project, and for us it's absolutely crucial that the Arctic remains a low tension area without conflict. And this is also when we have adopted the global security strategy of the European Union, in which the Arctic is specifically mentioned as importance to keep peace and security and low tensions. So for all these reasons I chose this SDG, but this having said, I would say there are all the other SDGs are equally very important to be applied in the Arctic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And true, I ask you all to choose your favorite goal from the list of 17 goals, but we can return to this also on the second round if you want to give your general remarks first, so as you choose. But now I will invite Donna and Welton, Chargé d'Affaires from the USA Embassy in Helsinki. Please.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to share some thoughts about sustainable development in the Arctic, and Aleksi noted commitment, and I'm going to cover that as well. I feel particularly privileged to be able to address this important gathering during the Finnish chairmanship of the Arctic Council, and to be here during the centenary year of your independence. Congratulations. The United States recognizes that the Arctic is changing quickly. As sea ice diminishes, the region's increasing accessibility, along with the presence of significant resources, inspires strong interest in energy production, shipping, scientific research, tourism, and infrastructure development. As all Arctic nations, the United States must be both proactive and disciplined in addressing changing conditions and defining our interests. An undisciplined approach could result in significant harm to the region, to our national security interests, and to the global good. Thus, we've adopted an Arctic policy that allows us to respond to these emerging opportunities in conjunction with our activities in bodies like the Arctic Council, to respond to those opportunities, but at the same time, we seek to protect and conserve this unique environment. So the United States has 6 objectives in the Arctic. One, of course, is our national security needs, protecting the Arctic environment and conserving its living resources, ensuring environmentally sustainable resource management and economic development, strengthening cooperation among the 8 Arctic nations, involving the Arctic's indigenous communities in decisions that affect them, and finally, enhancing scientific monitoring and research on local, regional, and global environmental issues. All of these speak directly to sustainable development. It is important to realize that security is a precondition for development, but also vice versa. We support the UN's 2030 Agenda as a global and a necessary and a useful framework for sustainable development. We will continue to be a global leader in sustainable development through our policies, partnerships, innovations, and calls to action, not least in the Arctic. Under the U.S. 2015 to 2017 Arctic Council chairmanship program, we focused on improving economic and living conditions, Arctic ocean safety, security, and stewardship, and addressing climate change. That the Finnish chairmanship decided to continue many of the efforts and to link them directly to the Sustainable Development Goals is a sign of our collective concern. I emphasize the Arctic Council because it is the only diplomatic forum devoted solely to the entire Arctic region. It was founded to address and continues to focus on issues of sustainable development and environmental protection. It is also the preeminent forum in which the Arctic states and the region's indigenous peoples address circumpolar issues. You'll explore these issues in depth at this conference. There are many frames of thinking to bring to this effort. In an emphasis on quality poverty reduction, the quality of poverty reduction, the Sustainable Development Goals bring both a moral frame, answering the question, abundance for whom, and a time frame, 2030, to help us expand our thinking and also focus on security and global prosperity. So rather than single out one sustainable development goal, I'd like to challenge the conference participants to add a third frame of reference to your discussion, design. We need to think more specifically about how to model solutions like carbon productivity, for example, for environmental, social, and economic returns. We need to make market mechanisms and make our politics work for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. There are still issues of great concern we must address together, including people's welfare and living conditions, our joint interest in being part of the Arctic's future, and being vigilant in protecting the environment. What kind of Arctic do we want? We seek an Arctic region that is stable and free of conflict, as my colleague mentioned, where nations act responsibly in a spirit of trust and cooperation, and where economic and energy resources are developed in a sustainable manner that also respects the fragile environment and the interests and cultures of indigenous peoples. That's the kind of Arctic we want. I think all of us here can agree that if we succeed, we'll meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. In other words, we'll have made development in the Arctic truly sustainable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much from your words, and from here we proceed to Kingdom of Denmark. Hanne Fogh Eskjær, please.
Thank you very much, and hello to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer. Waking up in this beautiful Rovaniemi this morning, I could really feel the famous Arctic spirit, so what a good choice to have us all gather here. I would also very much like to thank Finland and the Finnish chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Choosing the SDGs as the framework, as a key framework for creating a sustainable development in the Arctic, I think is the right choice. And I think that the message given by your foreign minister this morning, that the SDGs and that framework is actually our common strategy of survival for us all. I think it's a very strong message, and it also a good starting point for us working on Arctic affairs every day. The Kingdom of Denmark fully agrees with this priority, and we fully support the Finnish chairmanship priorities, and we're right behind you in seeking solutions, as you just mentioned. We need to take the step ahead and look at solutions. As colleagues have mentioned, of course, all 17 goals are equally important, and they are cleverly chosen, and they're very interconnected. And what is interesting is that we are globally obliged. We have all obliged ourselves to implement all of them. But when we look at the specific Arctic perspective, I would say that our starting point in the Kingdom of Denmark is that whatever we do, whatever policy choice we make, our starting point needs to be the needs of the peoples living in the Arctic, the 4 million people who have a daily living. in harsh and beautiful circumstances. There was a reference this morning to the second warning of the world scientists to humanity. And we're all aware, and we hear it often in these gatherings, that yes, the melting of the ice, etc., is creating huge challenges that we need to address and that we need to protect a very fragile environment. But we also need to look at the reality as it is, and we need to, in our implementation of the SDGs in the Arctic, look at how can we ensure that the Arctic populations can still fulfill a sustainable and economic development in this environment. This is our starting point, and I think that might be a little specific to the Arctic compared to many other places. I think the SDGs will help us ensure that when we look at opportunities and also the economic dimension of the future in the Arctic, we do that in a wise way, we do it in a sustainable way, we do it in a way where we have the future generations' prospects in mind. And that is when we look at the maritime transportation, that is when we look at green energy, that is when we look at tourism, for example, where we also need to be 5 steps ahead of this generation when we look at how will we ensure a good development in that area. To my personal choice, and I'm glad that we didn't choose the same one, so we get through several of them. It was a difficult pick, but I looked at the goal 17, and that is because to me, in my private life, in my professional life, partnerships, building strong partnerships with all kinds of people from all kinds of culture, with all kinds of background, that is the key to find the right solutions. We really need input from very different perspectives in order to succeed with these very, very ambitious goals. So goal 70 to me is really, I think, a key instrument to have a successful. We are doing that in a concrete way. The Kingdom of Denmark is right now organizing you could say a follow-up conference to the Arctic Spirit on the 1st of December in Copenhagen. And we do that in cooperation and partnership with the Arctic Economic Council, because we would like to invite in the business perspective, their ideas for creative solutions for sustainable development. I know that Arctic Economic Council will also be participating in the conference, but that's just one specific example of how we include partnership ideas in the way we go about Arctic development. If you're interested, you just can approach me after this session, and you would be very welcome to join us for a follow-up discussion and a continuous search for solutions how to ensure a sustainable development in the Arctic. I think I would like to end here, and I look forward to our second round. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And then when you continue to Iceland, the next chair of the Arctic Council, Arni Sigurdsson, please.
Yes, thank you very much, and I would like to echo my colleagues and thank the organizers for having us and invited us here to this beautiful city of Rovaniemi. And also I would like to commend Finland for her chairmanship and leadership in the Arctic Council. Now, the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs are indeed a remarkable achievement. We have set ourselves ambitious goals that are integrated and indivisible, global in nature, and universally applicable. So in practice, this means that we cannot reach one goal without working towards attaining others. And what we do in one part of the world matters in another. We must all do our part. The Arctic embodies what Agenda 2030 and the SDGs are all about, a region rich in natural and cultural diversity. It contributes little to climate change and environmental erosion, but the consequences are nowhere as visible. What is more, it clearly demonstrates how the world is interconnected. Furthermore, the good cooperation between interested states within the framework of the Arctic Council gives hope that states can put aside their differences and work together towards a more sustainable future. Now, most of the 17 goals are highly relevant in the Arctic region. Climate action, this is goal number 13, is high on the agenda, and Iceland has highlighted the importance of the sustainable management of natural resources, both on land and at sea. We are keen to share our experiences and work together with other partners in the Arctic Council to chart the way forward. The oceans are at the center of all our work. According to predictions, we will have more and warmer water affecting all life in the sea and possibly the way of life in Arctic communities. Based on science and innovation, we will need to sustainably manage marine resources to preserve biodiversity and ensure food security for indigenous Arctic communities. Access to renewable energy is yet another goal that can only be attained in the region through concerted efforts and innovation. The Arctic Council has taken lead in the field of renewable energy, focusing on projects to lower carbon emissions in the region. Climate change is causing the polar ice to melt, which again accelerates climate change, a vicious circle. While the melting of the polar ice poses grand challenges, we may also see the opening of the Arctic Sea Road within the next few decades. Throughout history, new sea routes have marked considerable progress, and in our globalist world, the Arctic Road will bring new economic opportunities to the region. While we must enable the Arctic indigenous to preserve their heritage and way of life, we are also keen to empower them to attain a level of social and economic development through education and improved access to health services. Now, Icelanders know from experience how important it is to preserve our heritage and culture through our language. In the same manner we want to protect biodiversity, we should aim to preserve our languages, which contain an accumulated wealth of knowledge. Iceland also knows firsthand the massive potential resting in gender equality, and this is Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which is my pick. In all our international cooperation, we emphasize women's empowerment. The Arctic is no exception, and Iceland has led the Arctic Council's work in this field. Empowering women is not only a human rights issue, it is an economic necessity. It is Iceland's firm belief that the sustainable development of the Arctic region requires an extensive and broad cooperation within the Arctic Council and beyond. International collaboration over the next 15 years will have to take account of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, as well as the Agenda 2030 and the new Sustainable Development Goals. These apply to all countries in the world, and these will be our guiding lights as we prepare for Iceland's chairmanship in the Arctic Council in 2019 to 2021. Agenda 2030 and the SDGs are grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we should be mindful that all of this is about people. It is about building a sustainable, prosperous future for people everywhere, including in the Arctic. So the Paris Climate Agreement and Agenda 2030 provide the blueprints for our success, and now we must deliver. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Arnitor. And then we will hear our next remarks from Mr. Åge Grutle, Norway's ambassador to Finland. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. My credentials, Arctic credentials, are small, but they consist in being the ambassador of one Arctic country in another Arctic country, which is quite important. I have visited Rovaniemi far more often than I visited Espoo or Turku. Not because Rovaniemi is Arctic, but because so many things are going on here, and it is so close to Norway, with which Finland and Norway has a 736-kilometer Arctic border. That geopolitical fact explains a lot about the centrality of Finland's Arctic areas to Norway and to relations with my country. One thing that sets the Nordic Arctic areas apart is perhaps that the Arctic areas are so well integrated into our countries. There are no sudden changes in Norway or Finland when you pass the Arctic Circle. Communications-wise, infrastructure-wise, lifestyle-wise. In most areas, our Arctic areas are part and parcel of our total areas. And that means that it's also to some extent not so natural to distinguish, to have an ironclad distinctions between them in terms of our national development. Also, when you think about the development, sustainable development goals, which are, to me, obviously relevant to our Arctic areas, just as they are to our countries at large. And also, it may be a reflection that, it has also become with the Sustainable Development Goals. It was probably clear even with the Millennium Development Goals, but certainly now with the Sustainable Development Goals, it has become abundantly clear that we cannot think about correcting the glaring gaps in human development without, at the same time, changing our development models to preserve the planet's ecosystems, which have been so good to human beings so far, but which we may be in the process of ruining unless we change our ways. So the connection is obvious in the Arctic area as it is elsewhere. Let me also say, although we Norwegians are not particularly known for our politeness, but I would like to commend Finland very much for the way they are handling their chairmanship of the Arctic Council. From our point of view, we are seeing a strong and ambitious Finnish chairmanship on top of a strong and ambitious American chairmanship. And since we can identify completely with the Finnish priorities for its chairmanship, it's easy for us to do as much as we can to be supportive of Finland in this role. I would also, at the end, again, without appearing to be too polite, it's a little bit un-Norwegian, say that I feel very privileged to be in Finland during its 100-year anniversary. A country that has, neighboring country that has produced and consumed so much history in 100 years is something to think about. I'm very also impressed that in spite of its history in a way, that Finland is not using the occasion to look inward, it's using the occasion primarily to look out, as it always has done, and to engage and to take responsibility and to do its share. Partly because, it's enlightened, it's self-interest in a broad sense, but it's also deeply impressive. I'm also finally happy to be the Norwegian ambassador in Finland at the 100-year anniversary of Sami organized cooperation across the border. I have never watched Oddasat, the Nordic Sami program, before I came to Helsinki, but now I feel the need to see it. And it's very instructive and quite interesting to see how this program treats the northern areas of our countries as a whole. And sometimes I have to watch for a good while before I can figure out whether this is from Sweden, Norway, or Finland. final note on Sami cooperation and the indigenous peoples. Of course, I and Norway can subscribe to everything that has been said by today, but I would also maybe invite ourselves not to forget the resource we have in Sami cooperation. I had the pleasure yesterday of dining or sitting next to at a dinner a prominent Finnish Sami educator who is now leaving her position to become the head of the Sami Film Institute in Kautokeino. And if I expected her to talk about problems associated with that, I could not have been more mistaken. She was talking about increasing cooperation not only in the Nordic and Arctic areas with Canadians, Americans and Russians, but also with highly developed cooperations with Maoris and Australian indigenous peoples, about budgets going up, about prices having been awarded quite recently, and about one, I think it was a New Zealand member who was already establishing something in Hollywood. So let's not, yes, the wounds of the past, we must do what we can to heal them, but let's here, as elsewhere in the Arctic, and Rovaniemi is the best example of that, I think, let's not forget what a tremendous dynamic resource we have in the peoples of the Arctic and Arctic cooperation in general. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thank you, Jörg. And I will also use this opportunity to thank your embassy and also the Canadian embassy for helping some Norwegian and Canadian participants to come to our conference. But we will continue our round, and the Arctic does not belong only to the countries who are exactly on the Arctic. And our next speaker is coming from a country which is pretty close to the Arctic, but not really. So, my colleagues, the Irish ambassador to Finland, please.
Is this on? It's on.
Yeah.
Sorry, is this on? Yes, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and may I open by thanking the organisers and hosts of the conference for the very warm welcome. The weather may not be at all warm for an Irish person, but I have to say the hospitality and friendliness is more than making up for the very real chill in the air when we leave this lovely centre. And I'd also, of course, like to congratulate Finland both on its chairmanship of the Arctic Council and on its 100th anniversary. As a small country which is also celebrating our decade of centenaries, which led us to becoming an independent state. Also, we were really touched and delighted to have been invited by Minister Soini to take part in this very special event. I am approaching this in a spirit really of being open to learning rather than having any particular lessons to offer on the Arctic Council. But I would say that my first encounter with the Arctic Council came about 20 years ago when I was posted in Canada, and we were in Ireland working very hard on a comprehensive agreement on a peace process on our island. And one of the things that I was asked to do was to research all international organisations of which Canada was a member, to see whether they offered any models or lessons for our own conflict. So there were two organisations that I looked at. One was the Great Lakes management structures, and the other was indeed the Arctic Council. Now, neither of those organisations had to address the kind of issues that we were dealing with in Ireland, but if you look very closely at what became the Good Friday Agreement, you will notice an organisation called the British-Irish Council, which brings together all of the regional governments on Ireland and Britain annually at heads of state level and at other levels, and I can assure you that there is a small thread of influence of learning from what was built around the Arctic in that structure. That said, just turning to the theme of sustainable development and what kind of Arctic do we want, I would like just firstly to say a few words about Ireland's view on the 2030 agenda. We are very proud to have co-chaired the process that led to the Sustainable Development Goals, and we see it as setting a benchmark for progress in fighting hunger, poverty and environmental degradation for the next 15 years. And we're proud of our role in that. But of course, pride in brokering the agreement is not the same as implementing it. And in Ireland, we also have our challenges in delivering that agenda. We see it not as a development framework aimed at the developing world or the poor, but a universal agenda that applies equally to all countries. And it is predicated on the idea that all countries are inherently unfinished projects. We are all continuously transforming and evolving, and we must now all play our part in seeking new ways to address the global challenges that we face, and climate change is to the forefront of these. All our countries are participating this week in the COP23 negotiations in Bonn to move towards implementation of our commitment in Paris to hold global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The 2030 agenda is a complex and wide-ranging agenda, and effective implementation at national level requires a broad and integrated domestic policy response. And I must say it has been very enlightening for me today to hear so much about how Finland and other small European states are responding to this agenda. We have set up structures nationally to deliver on our agenda, and it is led by our Minister for Climate Change and the Environment. It is being overseen by a cabinet subcommittee and by a senior officials group, which is chaired and overseen by our Prime Minister's office. We are one of 44 countries that have volunteered to present a national review of our international and domestic efforts to achieve the SDGs at the high-level political forum for sustainable development next year. And our first voluntary national report will allow us to share our experiences in internalising the 2030 agenda and to promote learning in a process that is still new. Lastly, we're working to ensure that our international development assistance programme, Irish Aid, supports the achievement of the SDGs in developing countries, and our vision is one of a sustainable and just world where people are empowered to overcome poverty and hunger to realise fully their rights and potential. And we are particularly focused on the central tenet of the SDGs, which is to leave no one behind. This applies across every country and region, and none more so than areas which are at the forefront of the impact of climate change and its impacts, such as the Arctic. If I could just say a word or two about marine issues, because I think this is one of the areas where we really have much in common with the countries of the Arctic. As a small island nation, we attach the highest importance to good management of the world's oceans, seas and marine resources, as saving our oceans for future generations is essential for global sustainable development. And this is obviously one of the key sustainable development goals, although it's not the one that I've picked. And in line with the SDGs, we must invest in marine solutions and ambitious political actions that mobilise change makers from government, business and civil society to turn ideas into reality. The very successful Our Ocean conference in October in Malta, another small island nation, was all about driving these commitments that will reduce marine pollution, manage aquatic resources sustainably, mitigate climate change, and set up marine sanctuaries. So, although my country does not currently have a national Arctic engagement strategy, but I hope that it will, I have found in preparing for this conference that a diverse range of Irish institutions at every level are engaged in projects with an Arctic component and are interested in exploring synergies with the region. Many institutions are involved in diverse aspects of the Interreg Northern Periphery and Arctic programme, and they include our universities, our institutes of technology, the International Energy Research Centre, and our local authorities at city and regional level. Their cooperation is often focused on areas of sustainable development, from the social dimensions of health and education to the creative industries to climate change and energy. And all of this is within the context, as Ambassador Marianne Coninsx has already addressed, of the EU's Arctic policy as set out by High Representative Mogherini and the European Commission last year. This developing range of Irish and EU engagement is most welcome, and I must say I have really appreciated today's opportunity to learn about Arctic developments, which I hope I will be able to use to inform and broaden Irish engagement with the Arctic countries and communities. As responsible global actors and close northern neighbours of the Arctic, Ireland, Northern Ireland and Scotland particularly have a role to play in addressing challenges and capitalising on opportunities in the Arctic. And many of our peripheral communities in those places have experience in managing the tensions between economic development and opportunities on the one hand, and environmental sustainability and community protection. We hope Arctic communities that are facing similar tensions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have less than 10 minutes left, and we have 7 of you sitting here. And in preparations, I asked you to consider 2 questions. One was to pick your own personal favorite goal of the 17 goals. Some of you mentioned that already, but I also ask you to think if there's some Arctic voice that you as a diplomat are not hearing much enough, be it from economy, science, people, NGOs, whatever, because if there's some voice that is not heard loud, you are not hearing enough, so it can also affect to how we are building the sustainable Arctic. So I propose that we go a very quick round with all of you, and then you can choose if you want to tell about your own favorite goal or about the voices that you are not hearing. And we could go in this direction, starting from you.
Thank you. Thank you. Is Don? Yes. Thank you. Just about my personal pick, why did I sort of pick the goal number 5 on gender equality? I did that because I think that is linked to so many of the other goals. If you look at things like no poverty, zero hunger, good health, well-being, quality education, clean water, reduced inequalities, decent work, peace and justice, I think empowering women and girls across the globe is extremely, extremely important. And this is why this was my pick, sort of. It's very important. It's very important to me personally. With regard to the second question, perhaps in our cooperation, for instance, in my case in Iceland, I mean, we are now preparing for our chairmanship program in 2019, and we have a broad cooperation with more or less all the stakeholders in the country, in other ministries, agencies, academia, NGOs, municipalities, and so forth. And business, of course. But what I think is we lack a bit is the debate with the politicians, with the policymakers themselves. I mean, we have, of course, our politicians in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs or in the Ministry for Environment, and we can discuss with them. But at large, the politicians in the Parliament and the political parties, I think they are more talking about the Arctic on a general, in general terms, but we not sort of involve them in the deep discussion on what is happening in the Arctic and why the Arctic is so important for us. So that is something I think we should do better. Thank you.
Okay, we go further.
Thank you very much. I think regarding the voice that I would like to hear more, I addressed already, with this very much the private sector and the goal 17. A voice that I'm very proud of, that we give so much and crucial space, is the indigenous voice. I think that's a very unique factor of our work in the Arctic Council, that we have 6 permanent participants representing the indigenous voice. That is completely changing the dynamic in our discussion and make it very substantial, that, like the president of the Sami Parliament said this morning, you know, we're doing for and with the indigenous people. So that is a voice that I think that we hear and we should continue to hear a lot too. If I can just pick an additional goal, that would be the one on education. Just like on the gender, I think that is the key precondition for achieving so many of the other goals, that we give the right education in the right languages for girls and for boys, and that we continue to a very high level. And that's another thing I think we should be quite proud of when we, as a crown jewel of the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council, was the signing or the signature of a legally binding agreement on scientific cooperation, that we oblige and we commit ourselves to make sure that our scientists can work freely among all the Arctic states. This is crucial, that our policy decisions are based on good scientific work among all of us. And here I really think that the observers can play a crucial role, from EU, from the Asian states, from many other European states, that we really need to work together, because there's so many unknowns in the Arctic still that we need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think this conference is actually addressing the voices that I would raise as we need more of, and that would be youth and subnational bodies. Those are the 2 key elements, I think, to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and as they apply to the Arctic.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, I have a lot of sympathy for one goal, which is education. But since my Danish colleague already mentioned that, I will pick another one, and that is climate work. Actually, I chose it because it is the existential goal among the agenda goals. Okay, then what's missing in the debate? Arctic cooperation is fairly good in bringing together scientists and policymakers, but it should be even better doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. I already expressed which SDG I picked out, but I would like to stress again that for us the Arctic is really a key example, unique example of constructive cooperation and partnerships. I think it is very much linked. So that is. But for the rest, I can agree. Gender, education, they are all key to the Arctic. I think there are many voices for the Arctic, but the issue is to listen to them. I was, 4 years, I was EU ambassador to Canada, and where also they attach a great importance to the indigenous populations in the Arctic. And I think that their voice can still be better listened to. For example, we have a certain the minister mentioned that we need innovative solutions for the Arctic, and the EU is very strong in scientific cooperation and finding innovative solutions, for example, cold climate technologies, but more and more also we are taking into account the traditional knowledge. So I would say, yes, there are many voices, but we have to listen more, particularly to the people in the Arctic.
I also think that we probably should listen even more to the voices of science. Since coming here as an ambassador, I've become much more aware of, for example, how incredibly deep and broad our cooperation is within meteorology, which you know, I had thought little of before I was happy to get an insight here. We have the whole university network, Arctic Universities network, with just an almost boundless amount of knowledge. Perhaps maybe the best scientists are too modest. They're not speaking aggressively enough, because unlike us, they don't only know what they know, but they know what they don't know. But I still think that for us to become sufficiently informed, enlightened, and have the sufficiently global perspective, we have to listen even more to science. And in terms of my favorite goal, I think being in Rovaniemi, I think I would pick sustainable cities and communities, and I agree very much with what was said. I mean, Rovaniemi has already demonstrated how much one vibrant city can contribute locally and globally, regionally. And I think we all agree with what was said. We have to hear more also about the good stories from the local communities. Yes, the problems, challenges, but also the many good stories, best practices. I think there are a lot of good things to hear that we're not hearing. Thank you.
Thank you. My favourite goal is the goal 5, gender equality, and I know I'm somewhat repeating what the other panelists have said, but one of the reasons I have picked it is because in a previous role I had a lot of dealings with our former president, Mary Robinson, who has done very pioneering work on the concept of climate justice. And she and her foundation make the point that women are often differently and disproportionately affected by climate change, ranging across a wide spread of issues, from land ownership to the lack of representation in the boardrooms of the large corporations which make decisions and take actions which can contribute to or ameliorate climate change and very directly affect the lives of others. As regards what is missing from this conference, I mean, I really don't think there's much missing, but I think it would be useful possibly to have had more parliamentarians here and more representatives perhaps of the multinational corporations that are active here as well, but perhaps that is for another day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all, and as a comment to your questions, so in the next session after lunch about Arctic economy, we will have your colleague, the Russian Arctic ambassador, and also the chair of the Arctic Economic Council and the chair of the Arctic parliamentarians of Finland discussing. So we have some of these key figures also coming up in this conference. But I want to thank you very much for being here, taking part of this panel discussion, and